Is the beginning. So my name is Nancy Savage. Welcome. This is, I believe, the fifth in a series of trainings between the Human Development Institute and UK Healthcare. So my name is Nancy Savage, and I now know the protocol where we kind of give a brief description of ourselves. So I'm still getting used to that, but I am a mid-career, I think is the word, woman, wearing a brown and striped shirt. I have shoulder length blondish hair. And our discussion today is being presented by the famous, fabulous Christina Espinosa, the guru in universal design. So she'll be talking about universal design in the workplace applications. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Christina to take it from here. So welcome, Christina, and welcome to everybody who's starting to join us.
Thank you, Nancy. Yes, I'm Christina Espinosa. I've worked with the Human Development Institute since 2007, and I'm one of the division directors. And so my training is in rehabilitation counseling, and I've always specialized in assistive technology and now universal design, environmental modifications, and just really making sure that we have transformed spaces that are as universally accessible and usable as possible. So thanks for joining today. Let's see, we'll go ahead and dig in. I know it's a quick 30 minutes that we have here. So I really just wanted to start with going through a little bit of what the definitions are that surround disability. Obviously, we have the medical definition, which absolutely has its place in the world. But the medical definition really has disability located within the individual. So it's where people are more defined by the medical condition. And it's incredibly helpful when accessing what people need, when attempting to maximize, functional capacity, and being able to simply just access the benefits that people need within the education and employment systems, and in addition to community participation. And then we have the ADA, and the ADA represents our legal definition of disability, and specifically our definition of disability as the civil rights legislation that is the anti-discrimination law that exists for people. So under the ADA, a person receives protections, right? And so it's really important for people to know, and for the full community to know what protections are provided under the law. In terms of employment, in terms of access to public services and supports. And so we have our different titles that cover different environments, right? But the model that the Human Development Institute works from, and the one that I literally get super excited and chills over every time I get to talk about, is called the social model. And this is where disability exists as a function of the interaction between a person and the characteristics of the natural, built, cultural, and social environments in which they live or work. So this one's really exciting, and I think really impactful towards real change in considering disability, because this means that disability can be removed from environments, right? If we are creating environments and spaces from the onset, from the development phase, then we can remove the features that create disability within that environment based on the individual's different characteristics, right? And so I love it. So the point here, essentially, is that when we're creating environments without barriers, there is no disability. And so I always like to just start with that kind of framework, because that's the way that we think about things. So a very important feature of that model is this idea of universal design. And you may have heard of it by this point. It's definitely getting traction very quickly. But universal design was coined by Ronald Mace. I thought I had this slide here twice for a second. Sorry for that. And he actually had a disability, and he was an architect. But it is essentially a strategy for making products, environments, operational systems, and services welcoming and usable to the most diverse range of people possible. So, notwithstanding what an individual's personal physical limitations or characteristics might be, the way that they learn, the way that they think, the way that they move, all different kinds of people are able to approach and use the environment or a device. And so the key principles overall are just simplicity, flexibility, and efficiency. And so that differs from job accommodations. And so just really quickly to give a brief definition of job accommodations, an accommodation is an adjustment to a work environment that makes it possible for someone with a disability to perform their job duties. So an accommodation can be specialized equipment, it can be modifications, it can be, additional breaks or different lighting, but different things that are implemented within a work environment or those kinds of adjustments to schedules or responsibilities. So the difference there is that it is something that comes afterwards, right? That's specific to that individual. So these are really a couple of really important features that universal design and that pre-thought and that pre-work really just innately and inherently incorporates. So universal design precedes job accommodations. While it does not eliminate them, there are still times, of course, when there's going to be some specific accommodation that an individual needs within an environment. But when we have these universal design principles that we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a minute in place, then we often don't have to identify disability or ask for accommodations because the scene is already usable by the greatest amount of people possible. So minimizing that need to, at an individual level, identify disability. And then it also inherently allows for all employees and all people who are participating with an environment to benefit from those features. So, some of us are tall, some of us are short. So having a sit-stand desk or an adjustable height chair and an adjustable height desk makes a big difference for everybody, right? And so someone can essentially come into that environment or that feature of a workplace and be able to use it from whatever position or height that they're in. And then also implementing these kinds of things from the beginning means no or less redevelopment or modification to environments is necessary. So it's the idea, there's that cartoon strip where all the kids are trying to get into school and there's a ramp and stairs and most of the kids are standing in front of the stairs and the janitor is scraping the stairs and the kid in front of the ramp is asking, if you, can you please just take the snow off the ramp because then we can all get in at the same time, right? So it's that kind of just intentional thought around environments. So again, just a couple of key features of universal design in the workplace. So these are pre-considered elements. They're deemed as effective ways to improve usability by all. And so in employment situations, this would be environments that are physical, environments that are virtual, and environments that are social. So if we're using these principles when we design environments, we're promoting participation by everybody. And it does truly create like a sense of inclusivity and a sense of that welcoming environment to everybody. Not having a space where maybe someone who uses a mobility device has to ask someone to move a chair or table so they can even enter the room, right? So that doesn't feel inclusive and welcoming. And then just promoting that participation and, allowing for us all to come in from our own human factors with our own set of features and be accommodated from the onset. And that can be more than just disability, obviously. That can also be age, gender, different cultural considerations, lots of things. So yeah, we talked a little bit about these already. Another important one though is that it addresses the issues of our aging workplace, right? So we know that our workforce is overall working to later ages, working longer for a variety of reasons. We're living longer. People have less savings. There have been tough times economically. People have maybe their grandkids living with them at higher rates. There's a lot of different societal reasons this is happening, but having these universal design principles also accommodates us all as we are aging into disability and different ways of being able to accomplish things. So, and then just the stigma of asking for accommodations. We know that there's a lot of research that there's negative coworker attitudes. So a lot of coworkers will have a perception that someone else is getting special treatment. So it also omits that. And so it's basically a win-win-win to be pursuing and working from the beginning to implement universal design principles. So now we're going to talk about what these principles are. We're going to go pretty quickly through these two because I know our time is short and also love to have some time to answer questions at the end. But There are 7 principles that, again, by Ron Mace, were developed back in the 80s. The first one is equitable use. So meaning that the design appeals to all people and avoids stigmatizing people. And that ramp example is a good one for equitable use as well. We wouldn't prefer to find ramps at the rear entrance or around the back of the building when everyone else is using the front of the building, or a front entrance, right? True equity for all would be a ramped entrance used by all. Even to a design and finance point there, ramps are cheaper to build than stairs. So creating a 0 grade entrance into the front of the building as a design element that doesn't favor one option over another. Another good example that we always use is, having accessible features on every web page. Userway was one of the early free page overlays that would build in all these features into any web page, right? So people could access the web page, same web page everyone else is at, and be able to adjust and use these different features as they found beneficial at an individual level. The second principle is flexibility in use. And so flexibility means that we have options. We have options for how we access things. So one example is having a railing on both sides of an entryway. So someone can hold the railing either with their right or left hand, and then also have that functionally to hold the opposite side when you're going back down the railing, right? So this doesn't only accommodate someone maybe with one side weakness, but also someone carrying a bunch of stuff in one hand or holding a child's hand in the other, right? So a lot of different ways that something can be used. The image I have here on this slide is a faucet, and it's a single handle lever. So for someone with one-handed use, it's a touch faucet, so touch activation. There's a lot of faucets now that also have, just motion censored activation as well. So you don't have to have 2 hands. You don't have to be able to reach and do things. You can pull out the handle to access filling a pot on the side of the sink if you can't reach to the bottom of the sink, but it allows for accuracy and it allows for flexibility. Principle 3 is simple and intuitive use. So the design is easy to use regardless of previous experience. So one of the best examples we often think of is the smartphone. We can pretty much take it out of the box and make a call. And particularly with iPhones, that's kind of been what they've been known for since the beginning of Apple, right? But accommodating all language abilities and physical abilities, there's large buttons, there's icons, there's bright colors that correspond with the information. For example, on an elevator, knowing that you're pressing the red button means you're asking for help, right? You don't have to be able to read. Seeing an elevator button light up when you press it, and it gives you that feedback. It's simple and intuitive, and it gives you the feedback that you need to know that it has been activated. The fourth principle is perceptible information. So this is where the design communicates necessary information effectively to the user, regardless of light, visual or sound conditions, or the ability to read, see, or hear. So this means we're getting directions in high contrast, that we have maybe some tactile engagement with, things that we can have audibly said back to us in addition to just being able to see them visually. So perceptible information should offer different ways of conveying the information. So we know that we only retain a fraction of what we see visually, auditorily. So when we're combining different means of receiving information, we are retaining more information. That's true for all of us, but it also inherently allows people with different abilities to be able to engage with. So I have an image here of a thermostat. And this one is displaying information. It has pictures showing you the house. It's showing you the sun. Red means hot, blue means cold, but it also has the snowflake and the heat radiant waves. There's large buttons that show you whether you're going up or down, right? So all of these things are universal design. Watching television, having the option to turn captions on, with that, and with video presentations like the one we're on right now, is also a really great universal design feature that is more and more available in all of the platforms that we're using to share information. The fifth principle is tolerance for error. And so this one minimizes and warns of hazards and errors. So it's really about safety and reducing the possibility of mistakes and injury. So the design can provide fail-safe features. So we're avoiding design elements that require absolute attention and require things to only be done in one way. We think about, the image here I have is of a nail gun. So it has built-in safety, right? So you have to be holding it. You have to push in and down before you can squeeze the trigger. You can't accidentally squeeze and activate a nail, right? Without having the full deep press safety. Think about GFI outlets that reduce the risk of shock in bathrooms and kitchens. Contrasting colors on flooring that represents a change in leveling, right? So an intersection or a step, or even just the difference of contrast between a wall and a flat surface, also called a hallway, so that you can see and there's a visual indication of where that shift is made for people with maybe low vision. The sixth principle is low physical effort. So ease of use, comfort, minimal fatigue, requiring low effort to operate something. Thinking about, for one example, the tension on a manual door. That is supposed to be no more than 5 pounds of pressure, right? Lots of doors that we go through at times don't have that. They're really hard to push or pull, but there is a built-in in those doors adjustment at the top of the door opener where you can release some of that tension to change that pressure. So knowing about these things, right? Thinking about these doors that can sometimes be wrestling matches. This is avoidable, and this makes it easier for everyone to be able to enter and push and turn, right? Having the user be able to remain in a neutral position, not needing to repeat actions multiple times. The image I put here is of an accessible shower. So having so many different ways that we can engage with this portion of self-care, right? There's a bench for people to be able to sit or to use as a footrest if they need their leg up for whatever shower activities happen. There are multiple grab bars. There is an adjustable shower wand on an adjustable bar, or a handheld shower wand on an adjustable bar, so that we can change the height of where it's placed if we do need to be in a seated position. There are shelving units at different heights so that someone who's quite tall doesn't have to bend all the way over in a shower. We know bathrooms are the most dangerous rooms in the house, right? Just because of water and slipping and injury there. So having these low physical effort options just allow for more safety as well. And then the last principle of universal design is the size and space for approach and use. So where the design is providing enough room for all users to approach, reach, and manipulate. So having different kinds of grips in regards to door handles, right? We prefer either the loop grips that someone can slide their whole arm into or slide a device into, or lever handles. They're just so much more easy to activate than knob handles. Size and space, for example, the photo here has a desk with some higher desk height there on the counter and a lower counter height as well. So that gives options for everyone to use an approach, including people who are using wheelchairs. This also shows someone using a cane and approaching it and finding an area of the desk where he can easily access what he needs to. Also thinking about curb cuts, right? We used to just have, a sidewalk ramp. Now we have curb cuts, which are essential for people with wheelchairs to be able to access sidewalks and safely navigate. But they're also so helpful for people pulling dollies or pushing strollers or riding bicycles or, whatever they might be riding. My kids are all about the rollerblades right now. So it makes it so much easier for everyone to use. So those are the 7 principles of universal design. I'll come back to this video, which is pretty cute, but I don't think I'm going to have time for it. But I will send this to you all. It's just a nice little overview of this family they call the normals and how universal design benefits them just in a regular daily task of going to all get pizza together and using the public bus route. But send that to you because it's a good overview and shows many different features of universal design. But the other part of universal design is called universal design for learning, and then we call that UDL. And this is also really critical in the workplace, right? But this is where we get into the design of instructional materials, of training materials, and activities that make learning goals achievable by individuals with a wide difference in ability to hear, speak, move, read, write, understand English, attend, organize, engage, and remember. So this truly also represents all of us. We know that we all learn in different ways. We all prefer to learn in different ways. We retain information and are able to express information in different ways. And this body of research has grown exponentially in the last 2 decades, right? But it allows or universal design for learning is achieved by having flexible curricular materials and activities that provide alternatives to those with different abilities. And so we're working a lot more to build these principles into instructional design and training materials and not add them on after the fact. And so there's a whole nother day we could do on UDL and how we do this well, but it just includes, using more plain language, breaking up, not having too many words on any page, right? Being as simple as possible, but also, that high contrast, using images where we can to also demonstrate and allow people who receive information visually better, offering training where we have the materials written, and we also have, the audible or the time to engage more verbally with the materials. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to implement UDL. I just wanted to introduce that idea to you guys if you hadn't heard of it already. And so then, yeah, we're thinking about UD in the workplace. These are just a few of the categories that we want to make sure that we're considering UD in. So workstations, I just talked briefly about even just the option of a sit-stand desk and adjustable ergonomic chairs, right? We want to make sure we have screens large enough that people have the option maybe for noise canceling headsets and headphones. And particularly people who are using phones quite a bit to have a Bluetooth headset. There are still people that hold the phone in the crook of their neck, and that's not good for any of us, but some people it's not possible for, right? So if we already have that kind of feature built in for everybody, it's better for everyone. In the work sites. So, right, this is making sure that people have access to locations and spaces and places in a universally designed way. The most obvious, again, of which is to have, a zero grade entry into the front of the building, to make sure that the work site has accessible bathrooms, preferably on each floor, so someone doesn't have to navigate between floors or take that much longer to identify and locate places. We think about technology, and there are, I want to say millions, but at least thousands of ways that we can be using workplace technology in universally designed applications to make things work better for everyone. And even just here at UK, we all have access to Office 365 now. We all have access to voice to text. We can be writing every email with voice or interacting with both voice and typing. For people who just experience fatigue, for people who need to pace a little bit more, they can be using their voice and not have to be in front of their keyboard all the time. We can also have everything read aloud to us. It's all built in to the technology that we have available to us through our employer. But the other really important area to think about is our policies and practices. We want to make sure that they're considering all of the different abilities that our employees bring to the table. And really, when we're doing this, and when we're doing this from the point of advertising positions, we are attracting and retaining employees in a much better, much higher rate in this competitive workforce. We know that there are 2 open positions for every employee these days. So overall, what I want you guys to really hear today is that adopting this approach of implementing and doing the pre-work and the pre-thought of universal design really benefits all of the existing staff. It improves overall productivity and morale, and it provides an inclusive business environment for customers, for employees of diverse backgrounds with diverse needs and abilities, and will honestly ultimately result in increased performance, increased success of every department in every workplace. But yeah, that's what I had for my PowerPoint, I think. I've got my contact information here. And I really would love to discuss any more, like if anyone has any questions or wanted to review any of those other slides, I'm glad to do that as well.
I was just gonna pipe in real quick before anyone else has any questions. So I've been at UK or HCI for a few months, and I think one of the coolest things I really have liked is learning about is universal design, because it's out there and I never really considered some things to be, just as I guess as simple as when you go to the grocery store and the doors open automatically, right? And you
Right.
could, that's accessible to someone who is a walker or who's carrying bags, or so it's made me really think about things that I never thought about before and how it's all around us. And I'm just curious. So UK has a universal design certificate program, is that right?
That's right.
How so with all the, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I mean, you can use it in construction. And what I try to be more aware about now is just when I'm doing documents, taking in consideration, maybe I shouldn't be using so many colors on top of colors, or
Right.
keeping it simple. So I just think it's a really great thing to learn about. So that's just my little personal perspective since I started here, how much I've really liked learning about universal design.
Yeah,
So
thanks, Nancy. And it is true. Once you start to see it, you will never stop seeing it.
you can't stop
And then
seeing it.
you
It's
can't
everywhere.
stop, can't stop, won't stop. And then
No,
also, like, once you start to see it, then you have so many more thoughts on how you can help assist people in your lives and in your workplace and within your staff, on how to set things up better, how to make sure when you're having a training, you don't have a table right in front of the door that someone has to squeeze by, right? You want
right.
that welcoming, open environment. And so there are, again, I want to say millions, but easily thousands of ways that we can be creating these spaces to truly include people. And that's what we're all about. Full inclusion.
Yeah, this stuff is really good. So thank you, Christina.
Absolutely.
And I've heard some in a previous, not all this. I always learn something new each time, but I will be reaching out to you because I want you to meet. I've already touched base with our facilities person here,
Great.
who leads all of our, construction, because it's good to reinforce. I mean, I
Exactly.
know probably by design and there are requirements and codes that we work with people with construction, but sometimes I still don't think people think. It's just, Nancy, like you say, just not even thinking about the fact that when you go into doors, they open there, there's nothing you have to, well, if you do, it's easily touched, but where is it?
Right.
I think one of the things about the Gatton, the Student Center, I think it's so neat is if you do have doors that you have to press something to open, they're lower, but they're also higher. It's not a
Those full
button,
height
it's full
bollards.
height.
Yeah, it's the
Yes.
full height bollards.
And
Those
I think that is one of the, I just think that's neat. I was like, wow. So you could use a foot, you could
exactly.
you could use practically anything to hit it or touch it, and it's longer. But lots of things, even to restroom designs and single stall, or how the naming convention for restrooms for inclusion. Like you say, I mean, typically if you're doing these things, you're making it better for many people, you
Exactly.
know.
Exactly. So can I real quickly, my favorite thing at the Gatton Student Center is the elevators. So I know there's only 3 floors and it wouldn't work within every building, but for the very first time since my friend Jason was hurt at 16 and he's 48 now, he can come up to an elevator and it has the full height bollards for an up and a down. And so he can tap that with his foot and call the elevator. And then it has the 1, 2, and 3 on the back of the elevator with, again, those full size bollards. So he can independently, for the first time since he was injured, call the elevator and go up and down in the elevator. He doesn't have to have someone push the little button for him, right? And so I love, it's the first time I've ever seen those. I use that example. I have
I
photos
have
of
to
it.
check it out. I never
Yeah, you
used the
definitely should
elevators
check
in
that
that
out.
building.
They're
So
It's amazing. And so if you're carrying coffee and books, if you're, if you have a backpack, if it's COVID and you don't want to touch things with your hand, because it is still COVID, you can tap it with your foot, right? So there's so many reasons that these things just make sense to have different options and variety in how we're activating them. But thank you so much for giving us the chance again today to talk about UD. It is really exciting. We do have an undergraduate certificate in universal design that covers both UD and UDL. So we'd love to, staff can take it for free, of course, staff and UK personnel. So yeah, love to have people
Great.
involved in that too. And it truly does, it does have implementation in every field.
yes, love it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
You guys have a
much.
Christina.
great day.
That was wonderful. I always learn something new every time you talk about universal
Thanks,
design.
Nancy.
Yes.
So thank you. Thank you everybody for
All
joining
right.
us.
Have a great day, guys.
Thank you both.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
All right.